Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight at what is sure to be a fascinating discussion. My name is Karen Ford, and I'm a current member of the Harbor Springs Festival of the Book Board of Directors. I'm excited to tell you that at this time, we are moving forward with our plans for a 2021 Harbor Springs Festival of the Book. The festival will take place the last weekend in September, and we look forward to seeing you there in person. We hope to be making an announcement with our list of presenters very soon, so stay tuned. We also have 2 in-person events planned for the month of August. Details will be available soon on the website and via email. On behalf of the board, I would like to extend a huge thank you to our many supporters of the festival, the sustaining bookend donors, and especially to the Michigan Council of the Arts and Cultural Affairs, and to the National Endowment for the Arts. We truly couldn't do this without you. This evening, you are in for a real treat as we celebrate truth in writing with distinguished authors Casey Cep, Becky Cooper, and Radden Keefe. The discussion will last approximately 60 minutes and will be moderated by Mardi Link. Immediately following the discussion, Mardi will present as many questions as possible. If you care to ask questions at that time, please use the chat button at the bottom of the screen. Now, here to introduce our distinguished authors and moderator, please welcome Katie Capaldi Beckel. I have had the honor of working with Katie in the book business since she was the ripe old age of 13. Katie is now the owner of Between the Covers bookstore in Harbor Springs and is also the festival's esteemed literary program director. Thank you, Katie, and welcome.
Last week, Becky Cooper shared the registration for tonight's event on her Instagram account. At the same time, she gave a shout out to her fellow panelists, employing such adjectives as smartest, most generous, and lovely. And I realized that these are the same words I have tossed about so often in conjunction with the presenters who have been with us for the Festival of the Book events. And tonight's guests are no exception. Some of you will remember Casey Cep from her time in Harbor Springs a couple of summers ago. She was on a whirlwind tour for the hardback release of her debut book, The Furious Hours, and her stop in northern Michigan was a last-minute addition. Casey has since become a good friend of the bookstore, and her generous spirit helped to create this virtual event. Through her story of a serial killer in the South and Harper Lee's involvement as a court reporter, Casey shows that the tendency to rewrite history has existed for centuries. Becky Cooper's We Keep the Dead Close was a favorite book to recommend last holiday season. A little weird, I know, especially given the myriad of tragedies at play and that total gut punch of an ending. But as we read of Jane Britton's brutal murder at Harvard in 1969, we learn, as Becky did, that a culture of silence still exists, especially in academia. And find me a die-hard fiction reader who wasn't converted by Radden Keefe's earlier work, Say Nothing, about the Troubles in Northern Ireland. With its blend of oral history, true crime, and narrative nonfiction, it's no wonder that Patrick's latest book, Empire of Pain, has been so highly anticipated. By taking a deep dive into the annals and legacy of the Sackler dynasty, Patrick illustrates how human greed can simultaneously build an empire and destroy a nation. There is no doubt that these courageous works of nonfiction, which aim to uncover the wrongs of the past, seek justice in the present, and illuminate a way forward in our society, make for engaging reading. But why do we, as readers, return time and again to true stories of murder, avarice, deceit, hubris, and humanity's most base instincts? Perhaps no one has asked that question more than tonight's moderator. Mardi Link is an enterprise reporter for the Traverse City Record-Eagle and has penned 2 memoirs. But she is still most well known by true crime fans for her books When Evil Came to Goodhart, Isidore's Secret, and Wicked Takes the Witness Stand. Mardi will lead our accomplished panelists in conversation about their recent work, research, discoveries, and obstacles to overcome in their search for the truth. Casey, Becky, Patrick, and Mardi, on behalf of the Harbor Springs Festival of the Book, and curious readers and thinkers everywhere. Thank you for your time, your talents, and your integrity as writers and journalists.
Thank you so much. I would imagine you, the three of you, during your research, because your stories take place over a wide span of time, and there's a historic element to all three of your books, I would imagine as you were doing your research, as you were doing interviews, as you were looking for documents, you encountered the question, why can't you just leave that alone? It's been so long ago. Why are you poking around in it now? So I'm wondering if you've come up with an answer for that question to the kind of people who ask that question. And because I know you just spoke, Patrick, but because you just testified in front of Congress, I thought you might want to go first on this one.
Yeah, I think there were some members of the congressional committee who wondered why I couldn't leave it alone themselves. I think it's probably, my answer would probably be a little bit different from Casey's or Becky's. I would expect. My last book was investigating a murder in 1972, and there I got that question all the time. With the Sacklers, it's different because there is this sense in which I think people have kind of woken up to what this family has done, and what they've done is made billions and billions of dollars on helping to fuel a public health crisis that's killed hundreds of thousands of people. So the sort of my mandate, if you like, I think was a little bit more self-evident to most people. I mean, not to the Sacklers or to their attorneys, some of whom may be watching us this evening. I think they probably tune in to see if I'll say anything actionable, or to their PR people. But I think otherwise most people got it. In my last book, it was much more a case of me sort of dredging up stuff that I think people had wanted to put behind them. And that's a tough question. And I would imagine that the experience I had working on that book probably resonated a little bit more closely with what Casey and Becky experienced, but I'd be interested to hear from them.
Casey, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Patrick. I appreciate parsing those two books. And I feel like to some extent, it's kind of the same experience no matter what you're writing about. There's always a group of people who are really excited you're writing about it. And then there's always a group of people who are not. And the question is, what's the ratio of the one to the other? And how much do you need to draw on the memories and archives of both sides? And I remember one time I was trying to report out the story of this, not the original crimes themselves, but the kind of incredible scene where the serial killer in my book is murdered in a funeral home. And, 300 people were there, and I had found a reporter who had been there, and I'd found by that point maybe a half dozen people who were there. And I was working my way down a list of names that I'd gotten from contemporaneous press reports and some of the people I had interviewed who remembered other people. And I called up a woman she was a relative of the organist who was playing music, and I knew she was there. And when I finally got her on the phone, she basically, Marty, said exactly the words you just asked us about. Why on earth are you doing this? Every time somebody looks into this, I say I don't want to be involved. It's done, it's over with, and what's your interest? And that's just to say, so people who are on one side of a horrific crime or related to people who are accused, or really just whatever proximity they had to trauma, they don't want you to dig into it. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want it to become fodder for other people's discussion. So I think with any of these stories, there's always a group of people who are eager, and there's a group of people who are not. And the trick is to make sure that you spend enough time with both camps. Because, of course, it was every bit as important for me to understand actually what was at the root of that woman's resistance to kind of going on the record again. She didn't want her name used. Eventually, she did want to talk and kind of share and speculate about what had happened. But, I just think it's always important to kind of figure out why the people who are talking to you eagerly are doing so, and to try to mitigate, the resistance of other parties. So I just, I think, Patrick, in your case, it's like, of course the Sacklers don't want to talk to you, but is there a Sackler who does? Or who have they talked to in the past, and you can dig up those records? Or in your case, I know you've made tremendous use of deposition and court documents. So even people who won't speak to a journalist, there's a way around their resistance because they've talked to someone. So, I can't say I had an answer other than, this is a story and I'm interested, and I'm not committed to a certain version of events. I, am under contract for a book, but I'm always prepared to learn I'm wrong, or the conceit of the book is wrong, or that, the story I think I'm telling is not the one I'm telling. And I found, at least with some of the people who were resistant, that openness and that candor about how, the way it's been told before is not necessarily the way I'm going to tell it, did sometimes lead them to want to participate. Now, again, I'm sympathetic to Patrick. None of those people were at that moment litigious, so they were not, sitting there with their attorneys being told not to say anything. So I don't mean to sound naive about the way that you can compel someone to participate. But of course, books are great because you have so much time. You can keep going back to people. They can change their mind, or you can come back to them with specific, legally vetted queries, or they can go over them and they can respond in writing. So there's so many ways around that resistance. But, it's always more interesting for me, rather than justify myself, is understanding why someone wouldn't want to participate. It's not always, oh, they're hiding something. It's not always, oh, they have animus against me as a reporter or against journalism in general. There's often a very good reason that they're resistant, and understanding that feels every bit as important to me as justifying my existence as a writer or the interest I took in a particular story in this book or any other.
Mm-hmm. I know I always remind myself, these are real people with real families and real lives, not just my story, not just the book that I'm writing. These are real people. Sure. It sounds like you do that too. How about you, Becky?
Yeah, I mean, I think the book is riddled with me reminding myself exactly how real everyone is in the book, and how much responsibility I feel in telling their story and telling it honestly, and also how much trouble I have in the role of the historian, like the detective and like the archaeologist, where so much of what you find is based on the question that you're asking. And, Casey, to your point, I distinctly remember there was one period of working on the book where I reached an impasse because the son of one of Jane, the woman who was murdered, her close friends, the son had emailed me and said, will you please reconsider what you're doing, because the people that you're writing about in this book now are in their 70s, but when this happened, they were in their 20s. And if they have found any peace, it's a kind of tenuous one. And who are you to come back and unearth this pain and kind of remove the scabs that had accrued over time? And he was right. I couldn't guarantee that I was going to offer resolution. And I had no idea that at the end of this kind of 10-year journey of working on the book, that there would be a solution to the case. And so it felt to me, what could I offer besides hurt and pain as a kind of certainty for the people who really didn't want this period of their lives excavated, having, the chance to have that trauma come back to the surface and re-traumatize them again. And I think what really helped me through that period was two things. One was that I emailed Don Mitchell, who was a close friend and neighbor of Jane Britton. He was one of the people who found her body. And he, at that point, had become a very close source for the book. And we communicated often. And at that point, he also was extremely nervous and sort of feeling these old feelings of the 25-year-old he was when he felt like the police were trying to leverage a confession out of him, because the police were suddenly coming back to his childhood home where he lived to do a DNA test, and he was worried that he was going to be framed. And so all this hurt and pain was resurfacing in him too. And I said, Don, why should I continue this project? How do I do it? And he had said to me, some people don't want to open up and update the narrative that they've been holding on for 50 years, but for me, there's a catharsis in both speaking about it, because it was a wound that had festered, but there was a catharsis in watching the narrative that had become so entrenched by telling and retelling it to yourself over time, and only to yourself, that by seeing what he called, new paths out of it, he felt less trapped in his version of events. And there was a kind of release and healing in that process as well. And I would say that the second reason that, and the kind of more obvious reason that I would give to people when I said, why I had to work on this 50-year-old murder was, at the very outset, when I hear, and that professor that you're talking about, he's still on faculty, I found it inconceivable that I would just whisper about this particular professor and be absolutely fine with him roaming the halls, letting this whisper be sufficient in a kind of communal sense of guilt, and a communal kind of bringing him to justice. Or on the other hand, that I would continue whispering about this professor, and I would be ensnaring a man innocent of murder in a myth about his being a murderer. And it felt unconscionable to me that was something that I could relegate to a whisper network. And I think over time, the other answer to the question for the hurt and pain that I was causing to some people in Jane's life was that there was a forking of my investigation where over time, it became clear that original professor wasn't the murderer. And so, who was in fact Jane's murderer? But on the other hand, why was he the person that history decided to pin it on? And it was at that point where I realized that Jane's story was likely functioning as a kind of cautionary tale about silencing and the marginalization of women in academia more broadly. And so it wasn't just injustice on one particular night, but it was a story that needed to be told because it wasn't, just in 1969, it was happening as recently as yesterday or today.
Yeah. Well, maybe readers would be interested to know, who haven't read your book yet, Becky, that you didn't just join the Whisper Network. You audited his class before you knew whether or not he was the murderer. So I'd be interested to know from all three of you to talk a little bit about your research methods. I know for myself, I start almost every book by putting together a chronology. I've had chronologies that run almost 200 pages, and all they say is what happened, when, and what my source is for the information, because I don't want to be looking for that later when I'm in the throes of actually writing the story. It also almost helps me kind of, if not memorize, then almost live with that chronology for a little while. So I'm wondering about your process when how you balance research with writing, with interviewing. Do you try to get all the research and interviewing done first and then write, or do you do everything all together? This may be a little bit of an inside baseball question, but I've got you all here, so darn it, I'm going to ask it. So can you talk about your process? Casey, do you want to go first?
Sure. Although, inside baseball is often like, the implicit reasoning is there's something to learn, and you'll be able to bet better if you get the right tip. And I don't want to oversell the, utility of my bespoke process, if it can be called a process. But you're absolutely right. I love a good chronology. I love a good timeline. I think that at the onset of an idea, those are often pretty thin, and, on the one hand, I'm working on one now that goes back to the, supernovas that first formed gold on this planet, because it's a story that involves precious metals down the road. So it's thin in the particularities of the story I'm telling, but, long in the sense of the context I want to make sure I'm thinking about and the kinds of questions I want to ask in the book. So I love a good chronology. I think those are really useful. I do tend to do as much reporting as I can, although what I learned with my book, and I imagine for Becky and Patrick, it's the same way, you're kind of never done reporting. I think it's silly to decide you're not going to write till you're done reporting, because you're never done reporting. Someone who won't talk suddenly decides they will, 10 other names emerge. The archive you've been waiting to hear from for 18 months suddenly does find the box they said didn't exist, or they give you permission to go through it. So I think it's really dangerous to try and kind of wait to write. So I try to write up things, as I do interviews, my impressions of a person, or when I go through a document, my impressions of that document, or, quotations, citations, additional source work I want to do. So I try to be really active and organize those notes. And I think the only thing from my process that I do tend to evangelize for, and I do it only because I think everybody else has moved on, and it might just be that I'm terrible at using all of the wonderful tools that, Mr. Tim Cook and Mr. Jeff Bezos and everyone else have given us. But I really like hard copy. I print things out, I make photocopies, the photos are there, and I have a really kind of tactile memory, so it's really important for me to like file the things away. And with Furious Hours, I had a banker's box that was the Reverend, a banker's box that was the lawyer, and a banker's box that was Harper Lee. And sometimes those ballooned out, sometimes I thinned them. Often things were kind of cross-filed, but it's like you said with the timeline, it's really important for me to kind of have the document or the deposition or whatever and kind of slot it in where it goes. And the organization kind of grows from there, but structurally, it's really useful for me to actually have kind of boxes that parts of the story fit into, so that I can start to see the arrangement and the organization. And I've kind of never been able to do that with Word or Evernote or, the programs that a lot of people find really useful. It's just, for me, the notes have to be longhand and the files have to be actual files. I can't quite do it digitally yet. So that's again, it's not really a process. Nobody would, pay money for the 10-minute guide to writing, but maybe Patrick or Becky have a more, I'm going to start taking notes. Ask them and I'll get out my notebook in case there's a better way. But yeah, I'm in my office and I look around at the stacks of papers that are kind of waiting for their box, and it is what it is, and I can't really see a way to expedite it or make it any more elegant.
I have that right there, as you can probably see, that stack.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, you're a stacker too. I see the books behind you.
Yeah. So Patrick, how about you?
Well, I should say, it's funny. One of my big insecurities around younger colleagues is always that I'm such a dinosaur, and I print everything out, and I'm uncomfortable on Google Docs, and so it's I don't know how much younger than me Casey is, but a good bit younger, and it's wonderful to hear that she's, I think, maybe more of a Luddite than I am. That's very encouraging. I'm feeling younger by the minute. Yeah, I don't know that there's any great mystery. The thing that I might say that I could maybe talk about that could potentially be helpful is how it's evolved for me over the years. I think I've changed over the years I've been doing this. This book that just came out is my fourth book, and I would agree that you're never done reporting. For me, it's certainly true that I tend to write pretty quickly, usually in a sort of furious burst at the end. So for me, it's in terms of just the time, like the months working on a piece or a book, it's 90% reporting, and then the last 10% is writing. But what is most important to me, and I realize some people don't do this, but I'm a fiendish outliner, and there tends to be a fair degree of complexity in the stories that I'm telling, and I really don't want. For me, the whole trick is to absorb that complexity and distill it in a way that won't be overwhelming for the reader. I think it's the hardest thing, and as a reader, it's the thing that I'm most appreciative of, when a writer has taken the time to do that. When they, it's one thing I think if very, very often, particularly in books, you'll have a situation in which you can sort of, if you know enough about writing to know what they're doing, you'll have somebody will go off and they'll do a ton of research, and then it's as if they come back and they just shove their research across the table at you, the reader, and they're like, look, I did all this research and now you can do it too. Here's 3,000 words on the history of Scrimshaw, or whatever the subject is. And for me, the trick is kind of doing all that research, but then figuring out a way to to present it to the reader that won't feel like a term paper. And the answer is outlining. And over the years, I've started outlining earlier and earlier. And so, I think part of the problem was that I make such a fetish of the research, and I can be a little bit compulsive, a little bit almost sort of OCD about research, where you read a book and you look in the endnotes and you learn about 10 other books, and then you have to read each of those and you look in the endnotes and you learn about 10, and it just proliferates and proliferates. And the same thing happens. I'm sure Becky and Casey have had this, and I'm sure you've had this experience, Marty, where you come up with your preliminary list. I'm going to call a dozen people, and then you ask each of those people, who else should I be talking to? And they each tell you the name of half a dozen more, and it just goes outward and outward. And so for me, there's a discipline in, at a pretty early stage, sitting down and saying, what is the story I'm trying to tell? What is the shape of this thing? Do I know where it begins? Do I know where it ends? Who are my cast of characters? And if I have a kind of rough notion of that, that's not absolute, but just a kind of a ballpark sense of what the roadmap is, it becomes really empowering, because what it means is that, and this may not be a problem for other people, it may just be somebody with my proclivities, but it means that the next time I stumble across some really fascinating thing that might be a rabbit hole, and I'm really tempted to take 2 or 3 days and just learn everything I can kind of look at my rough outline for what this book is going to be and say, that seems fascinating, but not really on point in terms of the story I want to tell. This individual seems like a fascinating character, but tangential enough that if I were to include her in the book, it would feel to the reader like a weird digression. And I think particularly earlier on, when I was still sort of figuring out how the kinds of books that I wanted to write, I think I sort of sometimes mistook the like level of investment I would feel in something just because I did all that homework, with the necessity to then put that in the story or in the book. And I've just gotten better about being pretty dispassionate about saying, while fascinating, that doesn't belong here.
Thank you.
I relate to that so intensely, Patrick. I went down a number of rabbit holes for this book. I figured out that the lie detector administrator was Woody Harrelson's brother or uncle or something like that, and learned all about the history of lie detector tests, and where his the archives of his lie detector stuff might be. But I think what was difficult in researching this book was that I had sort of set out to try to solve this unsolved murder. So no piece of information was, like, I would be remiss to label anything as tangential. And so I felt the responsibility to try to chase down every lead and every little, like, could this have been something? And the lie detector stuff, even though ultimately, like, I think it makes one sentence of a footnote, because I had the discipline enough, hopefully, to take enough of it out of the main book. That was important because, none of the lie detector tests for any of the 50 years of the investigation have been found today. So it's probably all destroyed. And so it was all in service of trying to do that, because then maybe it might have contained one germ of a clue that would have led to something. I think I'm a writer who's happiest doing probably like 40% reporting, 30% or 40% organizing, and then 20% like furious burst writing. I think, I had a quote from John McPhee on my bulletin board as I was writing the book, which was something to the effect of, all time touches all other time if only you find the right structure. And I think, I hear what you're saying, Casey, about the danger of waiting too long to start writing. But for me, if I start writing too early, then I don't know what form the material is asking to take. And so I sort of wait long enough until it sort of shows its own chisel lines. But I ended up waiting so long that I was really grateful that one of the disciplines that I had as I was going through the reporting process was I took pictures of absolutely everything, so I could remember the weather on like June 12th, 2000. I don't know, 14. I took pictures of everything in the archives because, something might not be salient to me the first time I go through and suddenly, oh, I remember who this, or now I know who this person is that's being referenced. And the other thing was that I kept a daily log, essentially, of everything I found in any given day and the emails that I sent and like the people I needed to contact. So I could kind of retrace my steps and also find my kind of psychology going through the process as well. Otherwise, I think it would have poofed into some kind of gestalt of my impression of it. And then I think, Scrivener for me is the writing software that I find indispensable. And I had gotten to the point where I put all of my research into one Scrivener file and had organized it by character and location. And then by the time I got to the 80% done and I could finally start writing, I created a new file that just had, 2 panes open. One was a fastidious outline of sentence by sentence what I thought was going to go in that chapter, and then a blank one where I would then kind of stitch it together. So, I was happiest really when it didn't feel like I was having to pull from multiple locations. And then the editing is actually the part of the equation that I'm taking out of the percentages, because I think that was where I was happiest. Reporting to me feels like so much luck. David Grand, a colleague of ours, had said when I was asking him, how do you approach investigative reporting? He was like, people will either want to talk or they don't. And so it every time I showed up for an interview, it felt like kind of the luck of the draw. And then then writing kind of felt like conjuring or like some kind of magic, but then editing was just puzzling. And it was like really honing that structure that I felt like I was kind of waiting this whole time to be able to discover. So that was where I was happiest.
Can I jump in and ask Becky a question? Is that okay, Marty?
Oh, absolutely.
When you're talking about taking the photos and stuff, did you know from the outset that you would be a character in this story?
No, but I suspected I might be. I think I was reading the Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and Rebecca Skloot was really good about the kind of braided structure of her narrative, and what was indispensable to her was having taken all those photos so that she could recreate that journey. I think one of the things that I realized early on was that likely it wasn't just going to be a straightforward true crime narrative, and there was the possibility that what really was going to be at the heart of this book was 2 young women kind of coming of age in academia and trying to navigate their way through it. And it just happens that we were kind of brought together because of her tragic murder. And so to leave open the possibility that that might be a narrative thread, I had to do all this extra kind of homework.
Yeah, I'm going to take advantage of the ask your fellow panelists. Patrick, I have a question, which is, so Becky, for instance, there, it's so funny, I guess, right away, I knew I was never going to be in my book. So the kind of, the detail of what was the day where I interviewed someone, if I knew they were going to be a character, I would try to make sure to think about kind of how they presented themselves, but there was kind of no reason to keep that body of documentation other than the ability to direct the fact checker to sources or, know which archive I'd drawn from. But Patrick, I'm wondering for you, how detailed are the outlines? Because I guess before I started writing my book, I knew the broad structure. I had no idea how the chapters would break down, but I knew, I was going to start with, it was going to be broken up into the 3 sections. I was going to, broadly speaking, move through the chronology of the 3 characters. But when you're outlining your stuff, how detailed, are you John McPhee, you've got the Geyer and it's 40 off-spokes of these are the chapters and these are how they work? Or how detailed is the outline that you're filling in?
It's probably every bit as detailed, but maybe somewhat more linear and unimaginative than John McPhee. For me, it's incredibly, when I did on my last book, this new one was similar, but on my last book, on Say Nothing, I had this amazing fellowship, really one of the more amazing experiences of my life. I got this fellowship to go to Italy for 3 weeks, and I have 2 small kids and lots of things that addle me at home. So the opportunity to just go and be, pretty much on my own, doing nothing but work around the clock for 3 weeks was amazing. And it happened fairly early on in the process when I was working on the book. And I spent 3 weeks outlining. So I didn't write anything. But what I did was I went through and I said, there's going to be literally like 30 chapters, and here are the different characters, and this chapter is going to focus on this character, and this is going to be this person. And it was, to Marty's notion of having a timeline, it was essentially, there was the kind of literal timeline, and then there's my different characters, and then all the different events in the story. And it was this question of how do you, what's the weave? How is this going to look? What are you, a big thing for me is like transitions. What are the transitions? When am I getting into a sequence and when am I getting out of it? And so that stuff I do in incredibly precise detail. And what ends up happening is that I just end up it starts with it starts literally with like a book or a piece. We'll start with 10 bullet points on the back of an envelope. And then what happens is that it just populates to a point where I'm taking the research and it's a quote or a statistic or an anecdote, and that stuff fills in. So it's funny when I hear people talk about the terror of the blank page, I never, ever, ever confront a blank page. But the point where I sit down to write, I have this kind of, it's like the sort of rough work in construction. It's all there. And then all I'm doing is the detail work.
It makes sense why your books read, or your writing reads so cinematically, if you're so concerned with the transitions.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. On the side, I have this like sideline as a failed screenwriter. I've worked for years, writing scripts for studios, none of which have ever gotten made. But it, particularly when I was a freelancer, it was like how I paid the bills. It was a funny thing where it took a long time. I think a lot of the time when you think about quote unquote cinematic magazine writing, it's awful. It's all sort of, like we open on, it's very kind of over the top. It's clearly magazine writers auditioning for it, hoping that somebody will option their story. And if they describe it like a movie, then maybe people will think of it that way. The thing that was incredibly helpful for me is in a script, there's such economy in the scenes, like a 4-page scene in a movie, a 4-minute scene is actually really long. And so it's all about transitions from scene to scene. And it's a strange thing to think, but I think my years of writing unproduced screenplays actually really helped my nonfiction writing in ways that I didn't really appreciate until after it had already happened.
I have a colleague at the paper that says she doesn't write stories, she builds them. Mm-hmm. And that quote came to mind when you're talking about your outlining. So we have a question in the chat for all the panelists. Do you edit your own work? And the question reads, as a non-writer, it seems like editing by another person would be invaluable, and pros can be very objective about your work. Can you talk about the editing process, what you do for yourself on your own, and when you bring in a pro? Anybody want to jump in on that one first?
Can I add one little element, one little adjunct to that question and throw this to Casey? So Casey's wife is also a writer, and I'd be very curious to know.
Yeah,
does Catherine, when does Catherine read your work?
So I was about to say, look, this is a great question. And I think like a lot of, look, we're talking about movies, and it's like people talk about directors and screenwriters as if there aren't hundreds of other people who bring a movie to the screen. And I think what's so deceptive about work like ours, I shouldn't say deceptive. There are some writers who really aren't edited and they work in their own minds, and they get a light copy edit and it goes to press. I profiled one of those for the magazine, but I think probably for all three of us, we're in a similar position of being really lucky to have worked both with incredible magazine editors and magazine staff. The copy editors and fact checkers at the New Yorker are remarkable. They're unionizing these days. If you're following that, there's a whole behind the scenes group of people at the New Yorker who make our work better. And I think that's true in Bookland too. I worked with a great editor at Knopf, and I'm sure Becky and Patrick will share their experiences. But yeah, I think the much more replicable process, and the process that I had for a long time as a freelancer, was before I was married, a very dear friend, and now that I'm married, my long-suffering wife. I edit my own work a lot before I hand it over. So to that question of can you edit yourself, of course you can, and you should be reading your work. And in particular, I would say you should be reading it out loud if you care about language, to hear how it sounds, to think about the rhythm, to try and make sure it's working at the sentence level. And Patrick's just given this great advice, and I'm going to try outlining a little more thoroughly. Revise your outlines, edit your questions before you go interview someone. There's no amount of revision that won't be rewarded in the work. But then, yeah, at a certain point, often when I'm stuck, it's rarely when I'm done. It's often when I'm stuck, I'll hand it over to my wife and say, is this making any sense? Or what do you think of this? Or, when you get to the end, can you tell me kind of what questions you have, or who you feel like you haven't met but would like to, or kind of what structure you need beyond this as a reader. So I feel really lucky to have her in-house. But again, that's why people form writing clubs, or you find someone to exchange your work with. It's why a lot of people go and do MFA programs. It's a wonderful thing when you find it. And I think cherish those people, especially the ones who tell you the truth, who tell you what isn't working, and who help you. It's not hard to find people who tell you your work is good. They just don't read it and they say it's great and you move on. But I think it's really rare and quite wonderful to find someone who's so invested that they really will always find something you could do better. Or, if they can't improve your specific work, they just give you a sense of, this piece really reminds me of Patrick Radden Keefe. Have you read Say Nothing? And then you find an author you can apprentice yourself to. Or, they say, your stories could be more cinematic. You should go read Robert McKee's book on story. This is working really well as sentences, but it's not working well as, a story arc. So you might consider going to read this. And I think that's important. And, the internet has made writing such a fast-paced phenomenon, and a lot of people aren't lucky enough to be able to take their time with it, or their book crashes and it's due and they can't do that. But I think, whether it's your best friend or a stranger in the writing group at the library, I just think those are really important kinds of scaffolding to build around your work, because it's very hard, I would say for me, impossible to do on my own. And I guess, Patrick, to your point, I will say, yeah, let me evangelize for the 2-writer household. It's great. You can wake up your wife at 2 a.m. when the piece is due the next day and just say, hey, I know you've been asleep for 6 hours, but can you just take a quick look at this? Or, let me read you this lead and make sure I'm not totally off base. Are you laughing? Are you crying? Or do you just think give it up and find a new career? So yeah, I really brought the editor in the house, but you can find somebody next door or the next town, or somebody you went to college with. You write to and say, I'm actually working on that novel. Would you have some time to read a few pages of it? And that's really, I think it's a relationship, editing is, and it's hard to have a relationship with yourself, and a more rewarding one comes from another person.
Becky? Do you edit your own work?
I do, kind of. I think Casey's point of reading it out loud, after I finished every single chapter of this book, I called my mother and I would read it out loud to her. And I, know her well enough that even in her silences, I could read boredom, where, I was sort of losing the tension on the rope. And so I'd be like, oh, that's gotta go. And it was great for the, the rhythm of the sentences, but it was also just great, to feel like I was writing this for her specifically. And so, it wasn't until it had basically done a mom draft before I then sent it over to my editor, Maddie Caldwell at Grand Central, who could decipher my brain vomit better than really I would have dared hope somebody could. She, as I was working on sections 1 and 2 of the book, I was having a lot of trouble kind of pacing section 3. And I had done my excessive outline, where kind of like the map of the hippocampus, there are parts of it that were oversized, which didn't actually represent how big they were on the body, but like it was how much like sensitivity was there. And so, you know, I had handed her this outline that like was way too long in some parts, way too short in other parts, and was like, can you make sense of this? Does this work? And somehow, you know, we didn't even know each other all that well at that point, because, you know, she had also known me enough to leave me alone for about a year. And then I, you know, was sending her, this was the third thing that I sent her. And she returned it with the most brilliant marginal notes where she was like, oh, I don't think you need to do this here. Oh, how about a little bit more of this? And somehow she could understand what my brain was trying to say, even before I think I could. And so, you know, her input was invaluable. And then I think, yeah, also to Casey's point, I have a group of friends from high school and college that I sent a very early full draft of the book to, about 5 or 6 of them. And I gave them each the same deadline. And I went through their revisions or their comments all in about, you know, a span of 1 or 2 days. And so I could see when, you know, 3 people agreed on the same change needing to be made in the same spot, that change needed to be made. If it was like 2 people agreeing that a spot was, you know, a problem, but they didn't agree on the same solution, I could choose a solution. And if it was just one person saying like, I don't know, then I could choose. And I think once you get to the point where everyone has a different opinion about the piece, then like you've written something. So I am enormously grateful for their honesty and their scrutiny.
Patrick, do you self-edit?
Oh yeah. It's funny. I mean, I think every writer is different, and I think relationships between writer and editor, particularly when they build over years, are, you know, they're almost like marriages. They're kind of impossible to understand from the outside. And I once had an experience. I'm gonna make a confession that I hope the 77 of you will keep in this small group and not share more broadly. I once had this experience at the New Yorker where somebody accidentally forwarded me an email that I was not supposed to go to me. And attached to it was a draft that had been submitted by one of my fellow writers, who's a big deal writer who I really admire, whose name I am not going to mention. And my confession is that what I should have done is just deleted the email because it was not for me. But I'm here to tell you that I opened that draft and took a look. And I was shocked because it was a mess. It was a real mess. And it was in a form that I would never in a million years share a piece of writing with an editor, or even like with my wife, frankly. But it was really revealing for me because the piece came out a few weeks later and it was polished and it was beautiful and it was great. And what it revealed was that in the dynamic between that writer and their editor, they had just a kind of different thing, right? That they had a different way of working where the editor clearly came in at an earlier point. The writer had the confidence to say, here's this thing. It's still a work in progress. Clearly, we're not ready to publish this tomorrow. I'm neurotic enough that I will not show anything certainly to an editor, whether it's a book editor or a magazine editor, unless I feel like they could literally just hit print and I'd be pretty happy with how it came out. That's not to say that it doesn't change. It obviously changes enormously when other people start getting their hands on it. But I'm just neurotic enough. And I think I'm sort of sensitive enough to the concept of the first read that there's a lot of things I'm trying to do in a piece of writing, affective things, where I want to make you feel certain ways. And I mean, Casey said, you know, are you laughing? Are you crying? All that stuff. I don't want to bungle those reactions the first time out because I sort of got the card trick wrong. Or you know, the better analogy would be like when you tell a joke and it sort of comes out wrong and you need to retell it. I don't want to be retelling the joke. I'm so encouraged. I've always been somewhat self-conscious about this, but I'm so encouraged to hear that both of you read out loud, because I do that. I read out loud to myself I read out loud to my wife. I read out loud, like Becky. I read out loud to my parents. I still, like, I'm 45 years old. I still call them. They're some of my first readers. I call them in Massachusetts, and every piece of writing I do, I read out loud to them. There's a year-long suffering friend of mine, my friend Michael, who still listens to my drafts when I have them, and I find that hugely helpful. If I couldn't read it out loud, it would be sort of hard for me to tell. Again, this sort of the kind of texture of the piece, I'm being inarticulate, but the way in which the piece sort of moves and affects the reader, I feel like is somehow easier to observe, even over the phone. I mean, maybe it's what you're saying, Becky, about the silences, but I just get a better feel for that, if I'm not looking over their shoulder as they read the text itself.
Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, it's so funny, we're speaking mostly from our experience, but I think one of the most surprising things, and it's not just something I learned from working on Furious Hours, but that the world learned about Harper Lee, one of the most best-selling, beloved authors this country has produced. If you're someone who had a chance to read Go Set a Watchman, you read the first draft of her Mockingbird story, and probably, like most people, you were not impressed. And you were shocked to see what, the original draft looked like. And, that book was revised over a 2.5-year period. And, to Patrick's point about the colleague who shall remain nameless, who turned in this awful draft that 3 weeks later was like a pristine New Yorker piece you'd read in the magazine. I think it's really important to remember not all writers are, perfect first drafters, and not all of them are solitary creatures. Writing can be a collaborative process, and plenty of people bounce ideas off an editor. They bounce reporting ideas off an editor. And then again, I just think the version of Go Set a Watchman that became To Kill a Mockingbird is such a fascinating example of how beautiful revision can be. The core story is the same, the characters are the same, and we work in the genre of nonfiction, but it's the same as fiction. You can change the point of view, you can change the characters, you can change the time frame, and you're telling the same story, but just, magnificently different novels. So if you are someone who's listening to this and trying to figure out, gosh, I have these awful first drafts, can I be a writer? I just think it's so heartening, if you have the chance to do archival research, like you go and you look at like the sonnets of John Keats or like, the villanelles of Elizabeth Bishop, and you realize there are 40 drafts for every poem you love. And some of them were written across a 5-year period where word choices matter, revisions improve, and just, it's a beautiful thing to see work get better. And maybe you're Patrick and you do it in the privacy of your office and you wait till the joke's perfect before you hand it over. Or you're the other New Yorker writer who just says, help, I think this is on its way, but tell me what you think and what I should do. And there's really just no one way to be a writer.
Yeah, right. And also I find the older I get and the more I write, the less happy I am with early drafts. The more work I put into it, not the less, Also, I cannot let Go Set a Watchman go by without mentioning that I shared a pub date with that book. Oh. So I have an unobjective opinion of that book. So we've talked a lot in generalities. I was hoping to just get to one specific. I know, sometimes in reporter circles, we call it the get. Like when you get a piece of information that's just pivotal that you never really knew that you were necessarily going to access. Maybe it's even a surprise. Maybe it's a document. Maybe it's an interview. Maybe it's a piece of information that ties some things together. For me, in my second book, I found a box full of sermon coupons. The Catholic Church puts out these sermon coupons, or did around the turn of the century, and they tell priests what to preach on that Sunday. And I found a box of this priest's sermon coupons where he had written notes about the missing nun that I was researching. So for me, that was a get. It wasn't anything I even thought existed, and then bam, here it is like magic at the archives at the University of Notre Dame. So I'm wondering if each of you have, what I call a get that you want to share with our audience. How about Becky? Do you want to go first this time?
I would say the thing that jumps to mind happened. It was the very, very last thing that I found in all of my reporting. And it was so miraculous that as I was writing, I was like, no one's going to believe that this is the last thing that I found. But so, the book really tries to bring Jane Britton back to life. It tries to kind of embrace her in all of her complexity and kind of recreate or breathe life back into her humor, because people would say to me, she was like Groucho Marx and Dorothy Parker, except without the mustache. And I could sort of hear what that might sound like, but I couldn't write that. And so I was terrified that I would be just doing this kind of like poor impression of this brilliant, witty woman. And also, so much of almost everything of who I knew her to be was filtered through the memories of people who knew her. So it wasn't, her coming from herself. And the very last file that I opened in the police records that were released to me when Jane's case was solved was her journal from the summer of 1968, which was the summer before she died. And I could not believe, I didn't know it existed, and I had no idea that that the police had saved it. And it was, it sent this, as you can imagine, this rush of emotion, especially to, as I'm wrestling, as I had mentioned earlier, with, why am I embarking on this project? Is it possible to tell a good, responsible story of the past? Would she have even wanted it? And one of her journal entries is, remember me the way that I was versus the way that other people see me, and tell my story the way that I really am. I butchered that quote. She was much more articulate than I was, but it was this almost sort of celestial kind of forgiveness and thanks that I never believed that I would ever get.
How about you, Casey?
There's a kind of I tell a story in the epilogue of my book that is probably the real answer to your question. And it involved like driving down to get a briefcase from the Harper Lee estate. And I think though, a more representative get, and I think one that's like as emotionally satisfying or important to me as the story Becky just shared, was actually kind of around the same time. Someone I knew who had encountered Harper Lee when she was working on this book, who was incredibly interested in history and archives, who I was convinced, someone had told me they had this rapport, they met at a cocktail party, and I was convinced that probably they had a correspondence, if not about the Reverend Maxwell, then about the area or Alabama history. And so I was just convinced of this, and I had tracked down this judge's daughter, and the daughter had donated his materials to the Alabama State Archives, and I'd been pestering the archivist to let me look, and then she lobbied on my behalf. And so, it was such a get the day, I remember saying to my wife, I have to get to Montgomery. They're going to let me go through Judge Coley's things. And I went, and it was like 16 uncatalogued boxes, and I went through everything and, was just convinced the next box was going to have the Harper Lee letters. Obviously, they'd corresponded, and, none of them did because they'd exchanged no letters. And I think that was a really important get, because it's an example of the fantasies you nurse as a reporter and the, limits of research, meaning there I am saying, well, they never exchanged letters. He didn't save them if they did. And if they ever turn up, it will be a wonderful thing, but they weren't essential to my book. And, sometimes the get is really just the ability, it's the closure for you as a reporter of like, okay, actually that's a cul-de-sac. It's not a fruitful path. And so I think that's probably every bit as important as, the briefcase that had useful materials, just because I think the process of reporting, to Patrick's point, it's really boring if you recount it all kind of minute by minute the way it happened, because if you're doing enough research and you're casting a wide enough net, quite a lot of the work you do as a reporter is just not relevant to the final story, because you're crossing things off and you're closing doors, and you're solving mysteries that are mysterious for the wrong reasons, not the right ones. So I love the story of the Montgomery archives that I thought were just going to completely change my book and then didn't at all.
Yeah. Patrick, how about you? Any
I mean, I'm probably like Casey in that there's a fairly obvious one for me, which is that with my last book, there was a moment I was sitting in this room and I made this discovery, quite by accident, looking at a transcript of an old unpublished interview that I had already read, but I was rereading it and I had missed something the first time, and it revealed the identity of the murderer in my story, who had actually pulled the trigger back in 1972. So that was a hugely exciting moment, and not one that I had been looking for. I didn't think of myself as writing a whodunit. I kind of didn't care who pulled the trigger, but when I made the discovery, it sort of gave a kind of Agatha Christie shape to the story that it hadn't had before. But honestly, to Casey's point, look, for me, this is what I love probably more than anything about this job, is that along the way, it's incredibly low yield. And I mean, I had an amazing story with with this Sackler book where I pretty late in the game, I got a message from a lawyer who had been involved in some litigation involving the Sacklers and Purdue, their company. And he said, I have 40 boxes of documents and I want to send them to your house. And for any reporter, I think this is an incredibly exciting prospect. And he was going to make it easy for me and send them to my house. But the problem is the Sacklers have been this is this billionaire family I'm writing about, has been threatening to sue me for 2 years. And they had sent me something called a litigation hold, which basically is a lawyer wrote me a very stern letter saying, because we will almost certainly sue you, all of your documents are evidence for the eventual case, and you cannot destroy any evidence. So you must keep everything. Don't destroy any notes. You can't throw anything away. And so I had this conversation with my wife where I said, a man is going to send us 40 boxes of documents and we can never throw them away. And she was just like, you're going to have to come up with another solution. Like, we don't live in a castle. And so, because there just literally would not have been room for the two of us and the dog and the kids, and the 40 boxes of documents. And so at the height of the pandemic, I flew to this city where this guy was, and I spent 4 days going through the boxes, just page after page after page. And in the end, there was nothing in the boxes that I put in the book. And it's one of those funny things where, on the one hand, I felt like such a fool coming back, having spent 4 days going through. But on the other hand, I am so wired. I'm like the mouse trying to, tapping the thing to get the pellet. I had
to do it.
I want that get. And if I had not gone and gone through every single one of those boxes, or if I'd gone through 25 of them, but there were 15, it would be bothering me right now. I'd still be thinking about it. And so I realize it sounds like I'm a crazy person, but to me, that is the magic and the thrill of this, and kind of the romance of the job, is that you are out there looking for those things. And if you found them all the time, it wouldn't be as thrilling as it is, in those rare moments when you do.
Yeah. I know that feeling. It's the greatest feeling. Even like what the two of you said, when there's nothing there, it's still a great feeling, even when you don't find anything, the process of looking. So there's a question in the chat from the Harbor Springs Festival of the Book to panelists. How long is your, I need to look into this at a later time file? What makes an issue or an incident rise to the top of the list for you? Casey?
I guess I wonder, there's kind of two answers to that question. One is kind of within the bigger structure of a book. Like, I know I'm writing Furious Hours and which leads am I going to follow? And it sounds like maybe Patrick's wired the same way, and possibly Becky is too, but she's polite enough not to reveal her neuroses on public Zooms. But it's like if I find it at 6 a.m, I'm getting up, I'm not going to bed, or I'm getting up at 8:30 to like make the call or send the email or write the letter, or try to find the address of someone who can answer the question. I think there's a different file, and I'd be curious for you all. Like, I think we all kind of do journalism that's not book length. So a story has to really percolate and reveal itself to be worthy of book length. And, Patrick, you've written 4 of them, so I'm sure you have an even more discerning criteria. But I have a different file, which is like things I might write about for the New Yorker. And, those sometimes I'm reading the New York Times in the morning and I write a little note to myself that says, this article, or, I print it out and it goes in a little file folder. And, sometimes a year or 2 later, I open that folder and I'm like, oh yeah, I was going to look into that. Like, I wonder what happened with that case, or, what's up with that academic I thought might be worthy of profiling, or has that novelist written anything new? And those I think, because they're not marriage proposals, they're not book length. That's a file for me. And maybe I spend a day looking into it and then I put it to the side, or, I send a couple of emails to experts in the field and say, if you ever have anything interesting, feel free to get in touch. Or I'm finally working on something for the magazine now that, like, I talked to my editor about like a year and a half ago, and it's a big story that we're kind of waiting for a way to turn it into a magazine story. So that file folder and that duration of like curiosity to peace, there's probably, a couple of dozen things that I'll never write, but that I've tracked vaguely. But within Bookland, if I know I'm writing about something I can't resist, I have no patience. I just have to call someone, send an email, make a document request. I really can't live with mystery for very long.
Patrick?
Yeah, I'm probably pretty similar to Casey. I'm always on the lookout for things and kicking the tires on things. I mean, for me, it's kind of the way this manifests is in my Google alerts, because I'll stumble across some interesting thing and I'll think, oh gosh, that's interesting, I should track that. And then I never deactivate the Google alerts. So I still get Google alerts for like some random person I read an article about in the Financial Times in like 2006 and thought, I should keep an eye on it. Literally, there's this guy in this Thai politician who I don't think I'll ever write about him, but every couple of days he does something and I get a little update. And there's dozens and dozens of those now. They haunt me. I don't know. I think, I think there's a tendency as people get older to get a little bit more discerning about when they'll do a piece, and maybe even a little bit precious. And it's a weird one because I can feel it happening to myself. And it's something I really want to not happen. I've always liked to just sort of just kind of roll up your, it's a job, you got to keep moving. At least for me, I don't, I don't want to get too paralyzed in the sort of, am I ready to commit to doing this as a magazine article? I'd rather just keep working and keep pushing. And so, I think that's the thing I'm struggling with now, is that 10 years ago, I was much more inclined to sort of say, okay, looks interesting, let's do it. I'll jump in and I'll sort of figure it out as I go along. And now I'm much more kind of, do I want to go to Bangladesh? What is Bangladesh like at this time of year? I mean, these are the types of sort of questions that I'm asking, literally, in my case, Bangladesh, like, how would one get there? What is the COVID situation? All of these questions that seem like very middle-aged questions to me that I was much more kind of just headlong jumping into things when I was a bit younger. So I'm hoping not to get too precious about what I take on.
Becky?
I think I am the most precious because I'm very slow. I'm slow to report. I'm slow to write. I'm slow to fall in love with something enough to commit to it. And I think, unlike Patrick and Casey, I think I do almost exclusively think in book length projects. And so I think the threshold for commitment for me is incredibly high. And I think it might be John McPhee, I forget who now, but he said that he spent his whole life writing about stuff that he was interested in at 10 years old. And I think for me, that is definitely true. And to meet the threshold for the love that I need to feel for a book length project, it has to be two things I was desperately interested in at 10. And so, for Jane's story, it was, I wanted to be an archaeologist. And I also thought I might want to be a forensic scientist. And so it was like, bam, those two together were perfect. And so, the thing that I'm weighing, do I love it enough? Do I know a way in? I'm just sort of keeping in the same like attic part of my brain that Jane lived in for so long is something else that, kind of cross-pollinates two loves that I had since I was a kid. But I think, I'm happy, waitressing in the meantime and getting another job rather than, because I'm so sort of slow, I think, waiting for something to meet that threshold and finding another job that doesn't drain the same energy and the same curiosity is for me the only way I can really make a life of this.
I feel like I laughed at you, Patrick, and now Becky, I'm so admiring of the, just depth of commitment and seriousness and discernment that goes in, because I really feel like I am the most promiscuous of the three of us. I'm literally finishing something for the New Yorker's website about Google Alerts because I also use them and I think they're an underestimated tool. And I ended up having a kind of emotional relationship to the characters in the book based on their Google Alerts. And there's a rapper who raps under the stage name Fetty Wap, but his given name is Willie Maxwell, which is the name of the serial killer in my book. And so, it's like, I'll write about anything. And I think, the web is a wonderful thing. You can write shorter things or, more essayistic things. And so, yes, I think maybe I better listen to the two of you and become more discerning and, exercise a little more discretion about what merits a piece, because as it is, I'm like, oh, Google Alerts, I've thought about those for so long. I'll write a little essay about Google Alerts. Everybody loves them. Everybody uses them. So on the one hand, I'm just glad to hear Patrick say he uses them too, and he's got dozens of them from the last 100 years of journalism. But yes, by contrast, again, no two writers are alike, no three are alike. And, these two, I love it. They're really, I think taking your work seriously is really important, and realizing that you have limited energy and limited time is important too. But yeah, I just want to stand up for the, promiscuous, just busy writers who really do just think it's a job and, will write about, set their writerly engine on Google Alerts and write something short about them. So yeah, write the way you write, think the way you think. And there's so many paths to being a happy writer in this world.
I can't wait to read that one.
Well, now maybe I have to shout out Patrick. I really need to know. I was trying at one point to get Google to tell me the number of users who have them and the average number of alerts per user. And I feel like maybe their record-setting case is Patrick, who's never deleted one.
Oh, I've easily, yeah. I mean, I have probably, I don't know, I probably have 60 Google Alerts or something. But a lot of them are for fairly obscure people and things, so they don't pop up all the time. And then there are others who, when I was working my IRA book, I had Jerry Adams, and Jerry Adams, you get Google Alerts every day, and I did disable that one. But
you use them, Becky or Marty?
Oh,
do you guys use them too?
Yeah. I also was a beta tester for a thing called Google Pinpoint. Have you used that? That was pretty interesting, and I put a bunch of documents into it, and then when I sat down to write the story, it would tell me, if I could go by names, and it would tell me how many times somebody's name was mentioned in all of my documents. And so actually it was really helpful. It's called Google Pinpoint. And I'm like you, Patrick, I can't use Google Docs. I use Microsoft Word. I print everything out. And so the fact that I could use it is, a pretty good recommendation. So this is the last question I have for you. And this has been so wonderful. And I need to use my notes to ask it because I can't ask it from memory. Casey, Reverend Willie Maxwell was never convicted of murdering 5 of his family members. And for some of those killings, he didn't even face a judge. And Harper Lee died before publishing or perhaps even finishing her book on the case. Becky, the investigation of the Jane Britton case didn't turn out the way you or we as readers expected. And some of the people who loved her still have questions, and maybe you do too. Patrick, after court cases, lawsuits, social pressure, and congressional hearings, members of the Sackler family remain slippery. Purdue Pharma has a felony conviction, not Kathy Sackler, for example. So my last question for the 3 of you is this. Can you live with the endings? Can we live with the endings of your book? Do they still keep you up at night? Or are you just on to the next thing?
I will start by saying that I'm still trying to get the DNA files from the Massachusetts State Police. I just want to get someone to check their work. That's it. I just want a second opinion that, you know, the analysis of complex mixture DNA, which is very difficult. And I think, you know, with increased complexity and increased difficulty, there's more room for the expert to need to come in with their analysis. I just want to make sure that what we're interpreting as a peak is in fact a peak rather than, you know, stutter, for instance, is a kind of artifact of amplification that you can get in these tests. And, you know, that feels to me like a door I can keep trying to open versus trying to understand the mystery of this red powder that was sprinkled at the crime scene. And, you know, all material evidence is lost, and, you know, the chemical analysis of it that was done at the time was paltry and only means basically that it was possibly iron salts. Like, that's not something that keeps me up at night, because it doesn't, while it haunts me, it is also not a productive haunt versus trying to get the papers that I know still exist within the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab. That is worth continuing to pursue.
Casey?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things keep me up at night. You know, COVID, the opioid crisis, the midterms, things I'm working on. But yeah, I think in a kind of delightful way, the sleeplessness or the kind of fitfulness of my first book. I love to hear from new sources about Harper Lee or Willie Maxwell or Tom Radney. I love when new letters emerge, even when those don't, you know, slot in. They're not pieces that fit into the puzzle I'm putting together. They're just, you know, human beings to the story, or someone reads something like that. So I certainly feel connected to the story, detective or problem-solving way. And of course, then the kind of constellation of human sources, people who shared their stories or, you know, opened their family archives. I hear from those people all the time, and you know, really feel like in that sense, the story will be a part of my life for the rest of my life. You know, I hear about their grandkids and their kids and their marriages and, you know, their careers, and that feels really wonderful and fruitful to me. And in that sense, you know, it's not just, you know, the little ripples of history move beyond it. So to spend time in archives, but it's also a wonderful thing to get to know human beings and learn about their lives, and not just in the instrumental way of what's the specific story I'm telling, but who are they and what do they do and what's their deal. And in that sense, I really do love the, you know, Furious Hours especially. I feel connected to that part of the South and Alabama, and, you know, it doesn't keep me up at night in bad ways. It keeps me up at night in good ways, and, you know, keeps my days full of lives I might not otherwise have crossed paths with. And I really do feel like it's a gift. And, you know, I just truly, I don't know, I think probably Becky and Patrick feel this way. I can't believe we get paid to do this, you know, paid to write books and paid to write magazine articles. It's really just a privilege and a joy. And in that sense, it's like your own life. Sometimes it keeps you up at night because you're just so excited and you're thinking through it. I don't think it has to be a restlessness or a troublesomeness. And I don't think that verdicts and, jail sentences or, settlements are the only kind of closure there is in the world. Telling someone's story can be just as satisfying for them as the conviction they never got, or the settlement that they deserved and they didn't get, or the loved one who was murdered or overdosed or whatever. So I think in that sense, populating your life with stories is a wonderful thing, and doesn't always have to be haunted.
Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I really agree with what Casey just said about the notion of sort of what constitutes closure. I think I've been doing this long enough now that there's a thing that I used to really struggle with, which is that I would write a big New Yorker piece about something or someone. It'd be a big 10,000 word piece, and I'd spend 6 months on it. And my ambition was to write the definitive version of the story. I wanted to write like the be all and end all. Like when that piece is out there, there's really no need for anybody to write another piece because there's that piece. And I think what I wrestled with was that my piece would come out and then life would keep going and the story would keep evolving. And people went to jail and court cases went on and people died and there were new revelations. And for a time, I felt almost injured by the idea that, that history didn't stop just because I had said I was done with it. And I've gotten much better about kind of concluding that there's the story you tell, which is this segment of time, and you try and capture it between pages or between the covers of a book. And at the end of the day, it's extremely subjective, and hopefully you get it right. Hopefully you've created a kind of a snapshot at that moment in time of what the story was and what it was to you. Hopefully you've captured some deeper truth that will resonate beyond the moment where your piece of writing comes out. But I sleep really well at night. I'm very comfortable with the idea that that I'm not going to capture in any definitive way any of these events or people and trap them in amber. And so even with this most recent book, I mean, there was this kind of crazy stretch not too long ago, literally just like 5 or 6 months ago, where I was frantically writing the end of my book, and the end of my book was happening in real time. And it was one of these things where I would finish, and then 2 days later something would happen, and I would go back to Doubleday and say, oh my God, I need to add 2 more pages, and was getting into a fight with the production people about what they could accommodate. And eventually they just said, pencils down, you're done. And there's still stuff happening with the Sacklers. I mean, there's big things happening this summer, but I also feel as though I told my version of the story, and others can come along and talk about other aspects of it. But I think I've gotten much better at sort of allowing time and stories to continue to evolve and making peace with the idea that I did my version of it. And now it's time for others to continue the story.
Well, thank you all so much for spending time with us tonight, for being so generous with your time, with your wisdom, with the world that you created in your books. I just really appreciate you spending some time in Northern Michigan, even if it's remotely. I hope you can visit us sometime in person.
Love that.
Thank you so much, Marty, and thank you all for watching.
And also thank you to Harbor Springs Festival of the Book. Thank you to Katie and the bookstore. And thank you just so much for bringing all of us together.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's nice to see you guys.
You too.